Well, President Trump's legal team is still challenging the election results on many fronts, Sean. Earlier today, Team Trump announced a lawsuit in Wisconsin alleging ballot abuse has affected 220,000 votes. Wisconsin, along with Arizona, both certified Joe Biden as the winner in their states last night. Joining us, a member of President Trump's legal team and executive director of the American Center for Law and Justice, Jordan Sekulow. Jordan, welcome to the show. Good to have you back.
Thanks for having me, Lindsay and Sean.
You bet. Good to see you again. Just when I'm sure you guys had enough on your plate, Attorney General Bill Barr goes out there today, does an interview, and he says that there's not enough evidence to prove widespread voter fraud. I mean, it's like you already, I'm sure, had a ton of states to deal with in terms of stuff, and then you get the Attorney General doing this. Tell me, does this have an impact on you guys? Does it matter? How big of a setback is it? What effect will it or will it not have?
Well, it doesn't have an impact on the legal challenges that are ongoing now, like in Wisconsin that you just mentioned, where it had to do with how absentee ballots were corrected. You can correct absentee ballots in Wisconsin, but the person who filled it out wrong has to be contacted, and then they have to come back and correct it themselves. What that lawsuit alleges is that 223 absentee ballots were corrected by poll workers instead of the actual people who filled out their ballots. So is that fraud or is that illegal? And I think that's how you can parse what Attorney General Barr said. Most of what we're alleging in court now is not so much about fraud, but about whether or not it violated the laws of the state. And if it did it then violate the constitutional protections of the right to vote for Americans in other states as well.
Okay, so Jordan, walk us through some of these cases that you have out there. You mentioned Wisconsin. Obviously, I mentioned that they are certifying Joe Biden as the winner there. I know that you guys did lose a lawsuit. Where do things stand right now in Wisconsin?
So Wisconsin was just filed,
right?
And that is a massive one, like you said. I mean, affecting up to 220,000 votes because of the way that the votes were corrected. Then we move. I think you've got to move into a place like Pennsylvania.
Hey, Jordan, can I interrupt you real quick? Because I apologize. Yeah. I'm not trying to, but I'm not a lawyer, so I want to understand this. So there's 220,000 votes, right? So they that are in dispute. So let's just say, and again, walk me through this because I want to make sure I get this right. So let's say the judge agrees with you. Well, if you throw out 220,000 votes and you don't know who they voted for because they've been mixed in, what does that do to a state like Wisconsin in terms of their electors?
Well, if you throw out 220,000 in Wisconsin with a number that slim, there's a very good chance that the outcome changes. It's not we're not 100% on that, but it's a very good chance because we know that Joe Biden voters favored mail-in voting in this election cycle and absentee voting in this election cycle.
But could you pull them out? That's what I don't get. I don't understand this. So let's say the judge says, you know what, Team Trump, you're absolutely right. They shouldn't have done this. And so those 220, are they set aside? Is that how it works?
They would be disregarded. Those 220,000 would be considered illegal
in like a
votes.
corner or something, right? My point is that we were just talking to Matt Gaetz about this, and they're not mingled in, are they? Or are they set aside? That's what I'm trying to get at. You could literally say those 220,000.
These are set aside. These can be set aside because they're all absentee. These are all. This is a challenge to all absentee.
Gotcha.
And there's kind of two options here for the courts. The courts could declare that the whole election was done illegally, or that it was just done illegally to these 220,000 votes, and thus those votes, unfortunately for those voters, should not count because they weren't contacted the way they should have been under Wisconsin law. They could have corrected those votes, and instead poll workers went ahead and did it for them. And that's what that lawsuit is alleging. So that's big. In Pennsylvania, we still have active lawsuits, one by led by Congressman Mike Kelly, that again is looking at kind of similar kind of issues, whether the state and localities could change, state law when it came to early voting and how to sign off on. Then you look at one that's kind of upsetting me, I'll tell you the truth, Sean, is Georgia. In Georgia, we just found out today that the Secretary of State, who's been under a lot of, I think, fair criticism, is now launching an investigation into fraud for the runoff election because of candidate Warnock and whether or not he was committing fraud. What about, was he committing fraud during the presidential election to try and make sure he secured that, number one or number two spot to get into a runoff with Kelly Loeffler. Why are we not thinking about if we think he's committing fraud now, why are we giving away fraud then? That leads me to Nevada. We've talked about that before, because Nevada in Clark County, they threw out 160,000 votes for fraud, but they only threw them out for the county commission race. They still counted those votes towards the presidential race. Well, Rick Riddell and the team he's leading, the legal team he's leading there, they secured a victory from the court today. They're going to actually be able to go in and examine Dominion voting machines in Clark County tomorrow. So, so some of that gets into the Dominion issue as well. I just want to tell your audience that I can attest to this, that we are still exploring every option available, working with states, state legislators, state attorney generals, and we're looking around the country and just looking at all the constitutional options. I know there was a lot of confusion early on. It's an uphill battle. I mean, courts are the place of last resort. They are not the first place you start to win anything. They're the place of last resort. And we say that as attorneys who make our living in court. But I want to tell everybody right now, we are up against a very tight timeline. We have to be realistic. Electors start getting selected on the 8th and finalized on December 14th. So that's the kind of timeline we're fighting. And, I wanted to be on tonight, even though I was traveling, to make sure people knew we are still fighting the fight for them to make sure that the integrity of this election was protected. Like those numbers you were talking about, Sean, those statistics from Wisconsin, those ballot dumps that were coming in, whether or not that's fraud or just conduct that is, again, illegal under state law. And that's different than just, saying something's fraudulent. There can be violations under state law and the Constitution. I think that's where the focus is right now.
Yeah. Well, Jordan Sekulow, thank you so much for the update. We'll have to have you back on to hear how some of these things are going as you continue this fight. And like you said, the timeline is starting to shrink here. So appreciate you giving us your time tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Sean.
You bet.